Ever since I started my photography journey, I've always dreamed of owning a Leica, and I finally got myself one, the Leica Q3. And to my surprise, I would be shooting it in JPEG mode. For full context, I've been shooting and creating content with Fujifilm cameras since 2018, and I've been shooting and creating content on Ricoh cameras since around like 2022. And before that, I was shooting weddings as a professional for 10 years. Ever since I got my first camera, I've always wanted a Leica. There wasn't a real reason why. It's similar to how if you're a car enthusiast, you'd probably want a Porsche or a Ferrari for no good reason. But as I progressed as a photographer, I actually shifted over to a 100% JPEG workflow, and that always kept me from considering making the jump to Leica because I didn't want to go back to raw processing. Why exactly did I land on the Q3, you may ask? Why not the M series camera or, even the SL series camera? And for me, I had three specific criteria. The lens had to be a 28mm. It also had to have a tilt screen LCD. And the third is that it had to have good JPEG profiles. Only the latest generation Leica models had the capability so far to have a JPEG profile. And I went with the Q3 because it was more of an everyday camera. Full disclosure, I did not purchase this camera at full retail price. I did a content partnership with mpb.com, and they asked me if there was a specific camera that I've always wanted to try out. So of course I told them the Leica Q3. But this video is not sponsored by MPB, nor is it associated with Leica in any official capacity. Because of that though, before I share my thoughts and impressions about the Leica Q3 and the Leica JPEGs in general, I did want to take a moment to thank today's video sponsor, Squarespace. I've actually been using Squarespace for over 10 years now, probably like 11 years. Their templates and easy to use interface make it incredibly simple to create and maintain a professional looking website without any coding experience necessary. My Squarespace website was an essential part of how I built my photography business. It allowed me to showcase my portfolio, share recent work on my blog, and also receive inquiries from potential clients through a contact form. If you're one of those photographers relying on, say, your Instagram profile as a sole place to share your work and build your photography business, I would really consider making a website on Squarespace. You can visit squarespace.com/Reggie to start a free trial and get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So I've had this Leica Q3 for about 3-4 weeks now, and usually that's not a lot of time for me to test out a camera, but within the first couple days, I already took it on a family trip to Disneyland, which I consider to be probably my favorite testing ground for cameras because you have low light scenarios, you have indoor scenarios, you have kids running around. I was able to put it through its paces as well as get familiar with how the camera performs for scenarios that I've tested the Ricoh in, that I've tested the Fujifilm in. So the first notable thing about the camera is the lens. You basically get a Leica Looks lens built into the camera. Usually if you bought this for the M mount, it's thousands of dollars. The lens itself is really amazing. It's super sharp. Sometimes it's too sharp. I had to dial down the JPEG sharpness a little bit. And in conjunction with the 60 megapixel sensor, it has really amazing cropping capability. I will say I didn't crop the photos that often, but what I did, specifically, for example, this photo right here, which is a family portrait, you can't even tell that it was cropped. The resolution is super sharp still. A lot of people say like, oh, it's a little bit wider than a true 28, which I think is true if you're shooting in RAW, because I think what they do is they bake in a distortion profile and lens correction into the RAW processing for the JPEGs. So if you bypass a JPEG, you won't get that. But because I'm shooting in JPEGs, it's pretty close to 28mm. I would say it's a smidge off when I'm comparing it to my 18mm Voigtlander on my Fujifilm. It's nice to just have a full frame sensor again. I will say depth of field is not everything, right? I end up stopping this lens down quite a bit and not shooting at full 1.7 all the time, but it's nice to have the 1.7 depth of field again for portraits to isolate details. It's not the most character type of out of focus, but after shooting with crop sensors since 2018, I think it's a refreshing experience to have my full frame depth of field back again. How do the JPEGs perform? Leica recently released their Leica Looks, which is basically JPEG film styles or film simulations, if you will, similar to Fujifilm film simulations that give a creative look in camera that you just bake into the photos. I've tried a few of them, landed on the Leica Chrome profile, which is a variant similar to Fujifilm Classic Chrome, except it's not as heavy-handed. I've noticed that a lot of the Fujifilm simulations very warm or very desaturated, and the Leica Chrome profile looks very similar when it's unedited to film scans that I have with my Lomography 400 film. In practice though, what I've been doing is reducing the blacks just a little bit and also adding like +5 or +10 on the white balance warmth, because I like the photos to be a little bit warmer, and I find that it's a little bit difficult to get it 100% right in camera. With that said, I'm not processing any RAWs. I'm only using JPEGs with this camera. I applaud Leica for building in that faded black point. You can't get that on any of the cameras that I've tried in terms of factory-made JPEG profiles so far. I will warn you that there isn't currently a way to tweak the film style in terms of like the ones from the Leica Looks, the chrome, brass. I think there's like a contemporary one, something like that. You can't tweak them yet, but I did find a hack. If you go into the standard Leica film simulation or film style and you adjust those settings, it actually flows back to the Leica Looks as well. Like, so if I go to the Leica standard and I desaturate it and I reduce the contrast all the way and the sharpness, it actually flows back to the Leica Chrome look. It makes it look more muted. So I use that to kind of adjust the sharpness in the Leica Chrome because it's a little bit too sharp for my liking. But eventually I assume that they may fix this and get rid of this like kind of like bug, or potentially they'll just turn it into a feature, which is what I hope they do. It's great to have an EVF back, especially this one. This EVF is very gorgeous. It's nice. It's big. It's better than what I've been used to on the X-T5, and the accuracy and the colors in terms of making sure that what I see in the EVF is what I get out in terms of the JPEGs, because I like to calibrate my EVF and LCD to make sure that it's exactly how I judge the exposure and colors. It's spot on. Kind of in conjunction to that, it's also great to have my tilt screen back. After I've been shooting with the XM5, the XS20, and the Ricoh GR3 and the GR3X with no tilt screen at all, I like having the inline tilt screen again and not the flip screen that comes out to the side. It just helps my compositions better, especially with a 28mm focal length. Being able to shoot low is just something that I need for my creative workflow. The Leica camera, you know, it has all the physical dials that you would want similar to a Fujifilm camera. It does not have an ISO dial, but you can map that to this wheel back here. It doesn't have like a T mode like a Fujifilm where you can dial in the exact shutter speed. So it forces you to use the full stops in terms of ISO and shutter speed and then adjust from there, which leads to kind of a slower intentional shooting practice. I would also say just like the burst rate of this camera is a lot slower. So it's forced me to shoot slower, right? I don't take this as kind of like a negative. I wouldn't want the camera to feel super fast just because it's a Leica and it has a little bit of intentionality built into the ethos of like the system. So I embrace it. I haven't really like missed a shot because of it. I still have my X-T5 and XS20 for those event shooting and faster paced work. So I see this more as a camera that I'll be using for more slower intentional work as well as just for fun. You know, similar to you commute with your Toyota Corolla every single day and you take out your Porsche to the hillside for some fun on the weekends. One thing that you can't not note is, again, it's a Leica. It's very heavy. It's very premium. It's got a hefty build quality. Everything feels great, sounds great in terms of like interacting with the camera. It doesn't have a nice shutter slap because it has a leaf shutter as well. So you get the advantages of a leaf shutter. I wish it was in silver. I always want cameras in silver, but this one is in black. Got the nice red logo right here, so it does catch some attention when you're out in the street. I have been loving the experience with the Leica, but it is not perfect. So we're gonna get into what things I feel like could probably be improved with this system. This camera is heavy. The design details are very intentional and more for aesthetic. So something as simple as like this knurled on and off button right here, if you're turning the camera on and off all the time, like when you're on travel, it starts to kind of like callus your finger or hurt your finger a little bit, which is something that I've noticed. But the camera, let's just be honest, it's not pocketable. It's not a compact camera in a sense that the X100VI or the Ricoh GR3 is. If you consider that a disadvantage, then yeah, it's a bigger camera. But if you think about what it is the same size as an X-T5 plus an 18mm 1.4. And when you compare the optical physics of everything and the image quality that you're getting out, it's even a little bit smaller than that. So you're getting a little bit more depth of field as well as the full frame image quality for the same size as the X-T5 and an 18mm 1.4 lens. So take that as you will, but it's not going to fit in your pocket. If you want something small, don't get this camera. So I love the EVF of this camera, but I will say the LCD quality is just not that great. And I tried calibrating it and I noticed that it doesn't have the same rendering of orange and reds in terms of accuracy as it does in the EVF. So if I need to check how warm or like how the skin tones are rendering in camera, I have to look in the EVF to double check, because the LCD, there's no way to just get it dialed in to look right. So that difference in color accuracy and quality is pretty apparent to me, because I use the LCD as a critical part of my workflow in terms of shooting with the Ricoh and the Fujifilm cameras. I think another quirk that I find with the LCD is that there's this little like black bar at the bottom. When you acquire focus and you lock auto exposure, like you can try to turn off all the menus and information, but when you lock it, it shows up at the bottom and it makes me think that it's not part of the composition. I've been adding like a little bit of gap at the bottom when I'm trying to get the composition right in camera. I don't know if it's a bug with the Q3 or this is how all the Leica cameras are, but if you're shooting in aperture priority, when you lock auto exposure and then you adjust the compensation, it knocks it out of auto exposure lock. Usually my process is meter the scene, lock the exposure, and then adjust compensation up and down until it's dialed in and then take the shot. I can't do that with this. I have to like set the exposure compensation first and then meter the scene, which is a little bit backwards. Like I've adjusted to it, or you know, sometimes I just go to manual because it's easier that way, but I wish there was a way that it kept and held the auto exposure lock even when adjusting exposure compensation. As a 100% JPEG shooter, you know, somebody that embraces the JPEG profiles of the camera, I really miss the fact that the white balance doesn't have like a shift function in terms of adding a little bit of warmth or adding a little bit of green or magenta or cooling it down. I like to use auto white balance and then shift it to a warmer tone so that I get the skin tones that I want as well as a little bit warmer photos. And I find that the indoor white balance with JPEGs is a little unreliable. Sometimes it's like too blue. It's too cool. And then it ends up making the reds in the skin tone a little bit too red. When I do warm it up in post, it's still just not quite right. So obviously you can massage this with raw processing, but again, I'm a 100% JPEG shooter, so I need this to kind of be dialed in a way that works for me, but we'll see what they do as the system matures. I think the other workaround for me is probably I just need to get better at manual white balance or using the Kelvin white balance. So the big question is, would I buy the camera like with my own money? Because I disclosed that I didn't buy it outright, right? For me, yes. After trying it out, I would totally buy it. Thankfully, I own it. With that said, I would say it probably would have taken me longer to purchase it outright, considering that it's a $6,000 camera and I wouldn't want to put my family in some type of financial predicament just to get this camera. I probably would have billed it to a job or, you know, saved up some money on the business side to buy this camera. But I do think that it's lived up to everything I expected it to. And if I dove into the raw workflow, I probably would love the camera even more than I do right now.